A human life lasts about 80 years. Maybe 90. If things go well, that's just how long a body keeps working. The nearest star to our sun, not a planet, an actual star, with its own light years. About 4 light years away, which means light, moving as fast as anything moves, takes 4 years to cross that distance. The fastest spacecraft humans have built moves at a fraction of 1% of that speed. Not even close. Which makes the question of how far a person could actually travel in one lifetime feel like it has a pretty straightforward answer. Not very far. Maybe not even out of the solar system, depending on what out means. But there's something about how distance and time work at very high speeds that makes that answer less solid than it seems like it should be. Thank you for being here, for letting this sit without needing it to resolve into anything specific. Some listeners leave a quiet note when they begin a small mark of present sand. Others don't. Both are fine. It doesn't change what's here. The problem isn't really about building faster spacecraft, though that's part of it. The problem is that distance in space is so vast that even moving extremely fast, faster than anything humans have ever built, still seems like it wouldn't be fast enough. The numbers don't seem to work out. A lifetime is 80 years, maybe 90. Stars are light years away, plural, years for light itself to cross. The nearest meaningful destinations, places with planets, places that might have something to see, are dozens or hundreds of light years distant. With current spacecraft, reaching even the nearest star would take tens of thousands of years, apparently, which is longer than human civilization has existed. Longer than the human species, maybe. So the distance feels locked, fixed. Like there's a wall built out of just how far things are and how long a body lasts. But there's this other thing, which is that time itself doesn't pass the same way everywhere. Not in some abstract sense, but physically, measurably. Time for something moving very fast, and time for something staying still, start to separate from each other. It's hard to say that in a way that sounds like anything other than word games. The faster something moves, the slower time passes for it. Relative to things that aren't moving, or rather, time doesn't slow down. In the way that phrase makes it sound, it's more like time for the moving thing and time for the stationary thing stop being the same time. They drift apart. At normal speeds, this doesn't matter. Time on a plane and time on the ground stay close enough that the difference is meaningless. But if speed keeps increasing, if something moves at a significant fraction of the speed of light, the gap widens. A clock moving that fast ticks slower than a clock sitting still. That's been measured. It's not theoretical. Which means, and this is where it starts to feel less like a straightforward problem. If a person could move fast enough, the time they experienced during a journey and the time that passes everywhere else would be different. Not by seconds, by years, potentially, or more. So someone traveling at those speeds could cross distances that, measured from outside, would take decades or centuries, while their body only aged a few years, or a few decades, while they themselves experienced only a fraction of the duration that everyone else measured. The distance between stars doesn't change. The space stays exactly as vast. But the traveler's experience of crossing it compresses in a way that doesn't match what observers see. A journey that takes from Earth's perspective 100 years might feel like 20 years to the person traveling. Their cells aged 20 years. Their heart beats for 20 years. They experience 20 years of waiting, thinking, being, while a century passes outside. That's not speculation. That's just what time dilation does at high velocities. It's built into how motion and time relate to each other. So the question of how far a person could travel in a lifetime becomes stranger than it seems, because one lifetime starts to mean different things depending on where you're measuring from. From Earth's perspective, the traveler might be gone for hundreds of years. From the traveler's perspective, they might age only decades, which means distances that seem completely impossible thousands of light years. Distances that would require millennia at normal speeds become technically reachable within a single human lifespan, as experienced by the traveler, but the place they left keeps aging normally. The gap between traveler time and home time stretches into something that can't be closed. If someone left Earth and traveled far enough, fast enough, they could return to find that centuries had passed. Everyone they knew would be gone. The world would have continued without them for lifetimes. So the distance becomes crossable, but the return to the same time, to the same iridescent. There's something about that separation that makes the question feel less like it's about distance at all, even though distance is obviously still there. It's more about what it means to go somewhere, when the act of going changes, how much time passes. When movement doesn't just carry you across space, but forward, through time, in a way that can't be undone. The limit isn't where you can go. It's whether you can come back to anything resembling when you left. It's the kind of thing that seems straightforward. Time, passing differently depending on speed until you try to picture what that actually means while moving, while the distance is being crossed. Someone traveling very fast, fast enough that time dilation matters, would still experience time normally. Days would pass, waiting would feel like waiting. Nothing inside the spacecraft would seem off. But outside, back at the place they left, more days are passing, not dramatically more. At first, maybe just steadily more, the gap widening. After a week aboard the ship, perhaps 2 weeks have passed on Earth. After a month, maybe 3 months. The numbers depend on the exact speed. But anyway, the gap keeps growing, and it doesn't close. It just continues. The traveler keeps moving through space, crossing actual distance. Light years, potentially. Passing through regions where there's nothing to pass, just empty space between stars. Nothing to mark progress, except the steady hum of everything and the knowledge that distance is being covered. That crossing takes time, real time, days lived through. While back home, more time. It's hard to hold both of those steadily. That the same duration, the same movement forward, through moments, somehow holds different amounts of aging, or not different amounts exactly, since a day is still a day. But the number of days elapsed is different, depending on where you're counting from. The traveler isn't doing anything unusual, just existing. Moving forward through their own experience of time, at whatever pace time moves. Earth is also just existing, moving forward. But those two forward movements have separated from each other in a way that doesn't have an easy comparison. When someone travels far away normally, there's a sense that you're still moving through time together, even if you're apart in space. The same calendar page is turning. This isn't that. The calendar pages aren't turning at the same rate anymore. Or they are. But if the traveler ages 1 year while Earth ages 5 years, then after 20 years aboard the ship, 100 years have passed there. The traveler's body is 20 years older. Earth is a century older, and the distance crossed during those 20 years could be enormous, depending on the speed. Hundreds of light years, potentially distance that would normally take it would take centuries for light to cross, but the person only aged 2 decades doing it. So the destination becomes reachable. The traveler gets there while still alive, still functional, But everyone back home has been aging faster. Not faster in their experience, time passes normally for them too. Just more of it. People don't usually last a century. Some do, but not most. Not everyone who was there when the ship left would still be around after 100 years. So there's this growing absence, not caused by distance through space, but distance through time, maybe. The traveler moving forward through 20 years, while home moves forward through more, moving forward through duration, but not the same duration. And apparently there's no way to sync that back up. Once the clocks separate, they just stay separated, keep drifting further apart, as long as the motion continues. Every day of travel adds to the gap. Every day of crossing space adds more time disparity between the ship and home, which means, and this is where it gets harder, to track the farther you go in space, the more separated you are in time, not just from the place, from when you left. You could cross 50 light years and age 10 years doing it, while home ages 50 years or more. That's 50 light years of actual space. Stars that were passed or empty regions crossed. Actual movement through the galaxy. And 50 years of Earth continuing, seasons happening, things changing without you there. The journey is real motion through real distance, but it's also moving through time unevenly, in a way that makes going back to the same moment impossible. Even if you could reverse direction and cross the same space again, not that you can't turn around. That's possible, in theory. Point the ship back, cross the distance, in reverse. But you'd arrive decades or centuries after you left, depending on how far you went, how fast you were moving. You'd arrive to a different time. So there's something about this that makes it not quite like regular travel, where going and coming back are just reversals of the same path. Here, the path through space can reverse, but the path through time can't. Or rather, it can reverse in direction, but not in the amount of time that's passed isn't reversible. The gap that opened during the outbound journey doesn't close during the return. It widens more. So going far enough means accepting that. Accepting that the place you left will have aged past you. That returning to the location doesn't mean returning to when you left. The distance becomes crossable, but the separation in time that crossing creates, that stays. There's something about that, about distance and time not being separate things anymore, but somehow connected through speed that doesn't settle into place easily. Like the problem isn't really about how far away something is. It's about what happens to duration when motion gets fast enough. And duration is hard to hold on to. What that means when it's not the same for everyone anymore. The movement itself would be continuous, not in stages or with breaks, but just ongoing. The ship accelerating, then maintaining speed, covering distance through regions where there's mostly nothing to move through. From inside, that motion probably wouldn't feel like much. Space doesn't push back the way air does. There's nothing sliding past the windows to mark progressive. There are windows, just the knowledge that distance is being covered somewhere outside, even though everything inside stays the same. But the covering is real. Actual space traversed. Actual light years passed through. Even if passing through them feels like just sitting in a room that hums quietly and never changes. Years of that, potentially not traveling in the sense of seeing new things continuously, but traveling in the sense of waiting while motion happens, while the ship covers ground door. Not ground exactly, since there's no ground but distance. While distance accumulates behind and shrinks ahead, the effort isn't in pushing, exactly. Ships in space don't need to push constantly the way cars do. Once you're moving, you just keep moving. The effort is more in the continuing, in staying functional across years of operation, in the persistence of it. And time passes normally during that persistence. Days aboard the ship feel like days. Slow when they're slow, faster when there's something to do. The usual way time feels when you're living through it, except that outside the ship back at the origin, back where the journey started, more time is passing, not dramatically more necessarily, but steadily more. The gap between ship time and origin time widening with each day of travel. That gap is hard to picture steadily, even knowing it's happening. The ship just continues. Days just continue. Nothing feels accelerated or compressed from inside. But if you could somehow see both clocks at once, the one aboard the ship and the one back home, they'd be drifting apart. 1 week of ship time might equal 2 weeks there, or 3 a month here, several months there. The specific numbers depend on velocity, but the pattern holds. The faster the motion, the wider the gap, and there's no sensation of that happening. No feeling of time diverging. Just normal days passing normally, while elsewhere more days pass. After enough years of travel, years measured by the ship's clock, the destination would start to feel less like a distant target and more like the only thing ahead. Not because it's gotten closer necessarily, though it has, but because everything else has receded so far back that forward is the only direction that holds anything specific. Stars ahead would still be stars ahead for months, their positions shifting to gradually for daily observation to catch. Only instruments tracking the slow change. Only calculations confirming that approach is happening, even though nothing visible confirms it. The waiting during that approach has a particular quality, maybe not impatient waiting, since there's nothing to do that would make arrival happen faster, just time passing while motion continues. While the ship keeps covering distance, whether anyone aboard is thinking about it or not. And during that waiting, back at the origin, much more time passes. If the journey takes from the traveler's perspective, say, 8 years, then back home, perhaps 30 years have passed, or 50. The exact ratio depends on the speed, but if time dilation is significant enough to make the journey practical, then it's significant enough that decades have elapsed, there while less time passed here, so the Earth they left, or wherever they left from, has aged considerably. People have gotten older in ways the traveler hasn't. Some have died. The world has continued moving forward through time, while the ship moved forward through space, and those two forward movements happened at different rates. That difference just accumulates. Every additional day of travel adds to it. There's something about that accumulation that doesn't settle easily. Not just that time passes at different rates, that part is just physics, apparently, but that the passage is irreversible. The gap that's opened can't be closed later. It's just there, permanent, growing as long as motion continues. Slowing down wouldn't help. The years that have already passed back home can't unpass. Stopping wouldn't make the clocks sync back up. It would just prevent the gap from widening more. So the only option is forward. Keep moving. Keep crossing distance while time at the origin moves faster. Arrival, when it finally happens. When the destination gets close enough to start thinking about deceleration, wouldn't close that gap, wouldn't reverse the temporal separation. The traveler would arrive, having aged, say, a decade. While back home, several decades have passed. That several decades is real duration, real time, years of events and changes and aging that happened without the traveler present to see them. The destination might be worth it, might have planets, things to explore, reasons someone would cross that distance in the first place. But reaching it requires accepting the separation, requires having spent the years in transit, having aged less while the origin aged more. And once there, the distance back is the same distance, just crossed. The same years of travel required to return, the same time dilation on the return journey, the same gap widening again. If the outbound journey aged the traveler 10 years, while home aged 40, the return would do similar math. Another 10 years here, another 40 there. 20 years total for the traveler. 80 years past at the origin, the world left behind would be nearly a century gone. Not the location, the place might still be there, but the time, the people, the specific moment of departure, all of that would be history by the time of return. So the crossing is possible, but it's also one way in a sense that has nothing to do with fuel or trajectory. One way because you can't return to when you left, only to where you left, much later. The effort of crossing distance becomes the effort of accepting that, of moving forward through space, knowing the movement is also movement through time, in a way that diverges from the origin. The ship continues. The distance accumulates. The gap widens, and at some point during the crossing, maybe early, maybe late, maybe not at a specific moment, but just gradually, there's a sense that the journey has already separated the traveler from the origin in a way that arrival won't resolve. That the destination might be reachable, but the departure point is already gone, already aged past, already it's hard to hold that clearly. The ship is still just a ship. The days are still just days. The motion is just motion. But the separation is there, growing, irreversible. If you send a message from the ship assuming there's a way to send messages across that kind of distance it would take, well, it depends on how far the ship has traveled by then, but a long time. The signal moving at light speed, which is the fastest anything can move, and still the crossing takes several rotations of the Earth, probably multiple seasons passing, maybe more, and during that crossing, while the signal is in transit somewhere in the void between origin and destination, time at the origin keeps moving forward, faster than time aboard the ship, so the place the message is traveling toward is aging while the message travels. By the time it arrives, the home that receives it has moved forward through more duration than the ship that sent it. The gap between sending and receiving isn't just distance, it's temporal, somehow. The message crossing space while the destination crosses time. And if someone there decides to respond, that response has to make the same crossing. Back through the distance, back through the gap, taking just as long to return. So an exchange that might normally take seconds, question, response, follow-up stretches into something measured in not days or weeks. Longer, much longer. One message sent, then waiting. Long waiting. Then maybe a response arrives. But by then, the situation that prompted the original message might be completely different. Or you might be different. Aged, changed, moved on from whatever concern triggered the sending in the first place. That kind of lag makes communication feel less like dialogue, and more like messages sent to an unknown future, maybe, or from an unknown past. You compose something based on your current state, and by the time anyone reads it, your current has become historical. Their current is something you haven't reached yet, and won't for a duration that's hard to hold steadily. The silence during that lag has a particular weight. Not the silence of waiting a few hours for a text reply, but silence measured in seasons passing, routines forming and dissolving. The ordinary accumulation of days aboard the ship, while somewhere very far away, more days accumulate. You might check for responses at first, regularly, habitually, but eventually that checking becomes less frequent, maybe. Because even if a response was sent immediately upon receipt, there's no way to know. If that happened, it would still be in transit for an enormous duration. So you stop checking. Or check only occasionally, without expectation. Just the background awareness that somewhere in the void between here and there, information might be traveling, or might have already arrived at the destination, and a response is traveling back, or might not have arrived yet. No way to know which end. That uncertainty just persists. Doesn't resolve into confirmation or disappointment. Just continues as ongoing uncertainty. The ship keeps functioning. Days keep passing normally. Breakfast, work, if there's work to do, sleep, repeat. The same rhythms anyone would develop, living anywhere for extended duration. Nothing unusual about the passage of time from inside. But outside, in the gap between ship and origin, the lag accumulates. Every additional day of travel adds to the distance, which adds to the signal delay, which adds to the temporal gap. Messages sent early in the journey might arrive at the destination after enough time that the person who sent them has continued aging, continued changing, while the message stayed frozen in transmission. The words arriving as an artifact from an earlier version of the sender. And if that message prompts a response, that response is composed by people who've aged considerably since the original message was sent. Their reply reflects who they are at the moment of composing, which might be very different from who they were when the original sender departed. So the exchange, if it happens, is between past and future versions of people. Not quite the same individuals anymore, separated by duration and change. That separation grows with distance. The farther the ship travels, the longer the lag, the more pronounced the temporal gap between sender and recipient becomes for any future communication. At some point, maybe not a specific moment, just gradually, the idea of sending messages might start to feel pointless. Isn't quite right, but disconnected, maybe. Like trying to have a conversation with someone who won't hear you for a decade, and whose response won't arrive for another decade after that. The words you'd send wouldn't reflect your current state by the time they're read. The response you'd receive wouldn't reflect the current state of the responder by the time you read it. Everything would be echoes from earlier moments, arriving too late to inform present decisions or concerns. So maybe messages stopped being sent, or were never sent frequently to begin with. And the journey continues, in silence, not the silence of systems failing or communication breaking, but the silence of distance being too large for information to cross in time frames that make exchange feel meaningful. Just the ship, moving through space, and the origin moving through time faster. And in the gap between them, nothing arriving, nothing confirming, nothing bridging the separation. The waiting for something that might eventually arrive, or might never arrive. Or might arrive but take so long that it no longer matters. That kind of waiting has its own texture. It's not anxious waiting. Can't maintain anxiety across that kind of duration. It's more like acceptance, maybe, or resignation. The understanding that responses, if they exist, operate on scales that don't align with immediate experience. So you just continue. Days passing, routines, if there are routines. Silence, if there's silence. And somewhere very far away, more days passing, and in the void between, signals might be traveling, might arrive eventually, might not. The uncertainty settles into something almost comfortable after a while. Not knowing becomes the normal state. The silence becomes expected, rather than concerning. You stop waiting for it to break, because braking would require information, crossing distance, and duration that make timely arrival impossible. And the separation that the silence represents the gap, not just in space, but in time. In the moment-to-moment experience of duration, that separation is permanent, as long as the motion continues. Permanent, as long as the distance keeps growing. Communication can't bridge it, because communication itself takes too long to cross it. By the time information arrives, the present it's informing about is long past. So the ship and the origin exist in different moments, separated by duration that can't be synchronized. And no amount of messages sent or received would change that. They'd just be artifacts crossing the void between past and future, arriving too late to connect the moments they came from with the moments they arrive into. The waiting continues. The silence continues. The gap continues widening. And somewhere in all that continuing, there's a sense that connection has already become impossible. Not because the distance is too far, though it is far, but because the time required to cross that distance means simultaneous communication doesn't exist anymore. Only delayed echoes. Only messages from earlier versions of people, arriving to later versions. With no way to synchronize the moments being communicated from and communicated to. Maybe that's just what happens when distance gets measured in light travel time. It doesn't just separate locations, it separates moments. Makes now here and now, they're into fundamentally different times that can't be bridged except by waiting for signals to cross the gap. Which means the bridging itself takes so long that the moments have moved on by the time the bridge arrives. The ship continues. The silence continues. And the lag just accumulates. The distance between ship and origin would just be there. Not felt in any immediate way, but there. Present as a fact that doesn't require attention to exist. Space doesn't push back. Doesn't make itself known through resistance or friction. It's just emptiness, extending in all directions, and the ship existing somewhere within that emptiness. Separated from everything else by gaps too large to cross quickly. That remoteness has a particular texture when the gaps stretch across light. The ship could be the only human-made object for hundreds of trillions of miles in any direction. The only place where someone is breathing, thinking, experiencing duration. Everything else, other ships if they exist, Earth stations, any human presence would be so distant that their existence might as well be theoretical. You know they're there, probably, or were there when you left. But there and here don't share any meaningful connection anymore. The walls of the ship would be the edge of the inhabited universe, in a sense. Beyond them, just void. Particles scattered so thinly that cubic meters of space might hold a single atom. Occasional dust grains drifting. Light from distant stars taking years to cross the emptiness. And in all that emptiness, no signals arriving. No confirmation that anyone elsewhere knows where the ship is or what's happening aboard it. Just silence in the sense of absence of anything coming from outside. That absence would settle into normalcy after enough time, not the temporary quiet of waiting for something to arrive, but the permanent quiet of nothing arriving, because nothing can cross the gap fast enough to feel like communication. Days aboard the ship would still pass, waking, whatever tasks need doing, eating, if there's food, sleeping, the ordinary rhythms of existence, continuing whether or not anything outside the ship is aware of them. The stars visible through whatever viewing ports exist, if looking outside is even possible, it appear fixed, unchanging day to day. You'd have to watch for months to notice their positions, shifting as the ship moves through the galaxy. And even then, the shift would be subtle, barely perceptible, So the sensation of motion wouldn't come from seeing things pass by, would come only from instruments, from calculations, from the knowledge that distance is accumulating somewhere outside, even though nothing visible confirms it. And that distance, it separates more than just locations. It separates the ship's present from Earth's present tour, wherever the origin was. The temporal gap has grown wide enough by this point in the journey that now aboard the ship and now back, there are fundamentally different times. Not different in experience, time still passes, normally in both places, but different in the sense that they don't overlap anymore, don't share simultaneity. The ships today and Earths today are separated by however much duration the time dilation has accumulated. Could be years, could be decades. So even thinking about Earth, if you think about it, if it still seems worth thinking about, means imagining a place that exists in a different moment. A place where more time has passed, where people have aged more, where whatever you remember has had much longer to change. That version of Earth you left is gone, not because the location disappeared, but because that particular moment in its history is gone. Moved on, aged past. The isolation is complete, maybe. Not in a dramatic sense, just in the sense that the ship exists in its own bubble of time, separate from other bubbles. Your experience of duration doesn't align with anyone else's anymore, and there's nothing particularly urgent about that. It's just how things are when distance gets large enough and velocity gets high enough. Time diverges, locations separate, and what you're left with is this existence in a place that has no contemporaneous connection to anywhere else. The void outside would still be there, still empty, still extending in all directions, with nothing in it except scattered atoms and distant light. The ship would still be there, still functioning, or failing slowly, or whatever state it's in, after however long the journey has been. You would still be there, aging at your own rate, which is slower than the rate elsewhere, but feels normal because it's the only rate you experience. And the gap, spatial, temporal, both would still be there, not growing more because growth implies change. And at this point, the separation just is, has reached a state where it doesn't need to increase further to be complete. There's something about that completeness that's hard to articulate. The sense that you've crossed beyond some threshold where return becomes not impossible, exactly, but meaningless in any way that would restore connection. You could reverse trajectory, cross back toward the origin, but you'd arrive at a time so far ahead of your departure that nothing familiar would remain except maybe geography. So the journey has become one way, not because the path can't be retraced, but because the moment you left can't be returned to. Only the location can be returned to second, and locations without their moments are just coordinates. Places that don't mean what they meant when you left them. The ship drifts through the void, or moves at high velocity through its same thing, when there's nothing to move past, nothing to mark the difference between motion and stillness. Time passes aboard. Maybe routines have formed. Maybe they've dissolved. Maybe they were never there. Doesn't particularly matter. Duration accumulates either way. And elsewhere, very far, elsewhere, more duration accumulates. The gap between the two accumulations is permanent, unbridgeable by anything except waiting. And waiting doesn't close gaps. It just moves both sides forward at different speeds. The silence holds, the distance holds. The separation, temporal, spatial, absolute holds. Nothing breaks it. Nothing needs to break it. It's just the state of things. When you've traveled far enough and fast enough, that connection to the origin becomes impossible in any meaningful sense. And you exist within that impossibility, breathing, aging slowly, relative to elsewhere, occupying the present moment, which is the only moment available, but a moment that doesn't coincide with present moments anywhere else. The aloneness of that has weight, but it's a quiet weight, background weight, the kind you notice when you pay attention, but can ignore when you don't. The ship is still just a ship. The void is still just void. You're still just here, wherever here is. And that's enough, or it isn't. But either way, it's what remains. There's no way to know what's happening back at the origin anymore. Not just difficult, impossible, in any current sense. Information moves at light speed. The distance between ship and origin is measured in light years by this point. Maybe many light years, so any knowledge about Earth, or wherever the departure happened, is delayed by however long light takes to cross that distance. Years, possibly decades. Any information that arrives, if information is still being sent, if anyone there is still transmitting, describes a past state, how things were when the signal left, not how things are when it arrives. The current state is hidden behind that delay, behind the time required for light to bridge the gap. Earth could have changed completely since the last information crossed the distance. Cities grown or gone. Technologies advanced. People aged, died, been replaced by generations who never knew about the ship. Or maybe nothing changed. Maybe everything is roughly similar to how it was. There's no way to tell from here. The uncertainty isn't distressing, exactly just. Present A. Background awareness that the place you left exists in some state. But that state is sealed off. Inaccessible, behind distance and the speed limit of knowing. You could imagine it unchanged. Picture the streets, the buildings, people going about familiar patterns. That imagining feels real enough while you're doing it. But it's just imagination. The actual state, whatever it is, exists beyond reach. And the destination, whatever you're heading toward, is equally unknowable until arrival. The star system ahead has something, a star, at minimum, burning through its hydrogen. Whether there are planets, whether those planets have atmospheres or surfaces worth observing, whether there's anything there that would make the crossing feel justified, of that stays hidden until you're close enough to observe directly. Instruments can detect large features from a distance, spectral signatures, orbital mechanics if there are orbiting bodies. But the details, the things that matter, those wait behind the remaining distance. So the journey is toward uncertainty. Not complete unknown. There's clearly a star there, clearly something to arrive at, but uncertain enough that expectations feel unreliable maybe. You might find what you hoped for, or find nothing like it, or find something that doesn't fit into either category. And back at the origin, the people there, if they're still there, if they're still tracking the mission, if anyone remembers, won't know what was found for years after the finding. Signals have to cross back, have to traverse the same distance that already took years to cross outbound. By the time confirmation arrives, whatever was discovered will be old news to the discoverer. Ancient news, depending on the velocity and distance involved. The ship and the origin exist in separate information states. Neither knows the current condition of the other. Neither can update or correct or confirm assumptions. That separation isn't just about space anymore, or time. It's about knowing, maybe. About what can be verified versus what has to be assumed or remembered or guessed. And the separation grows as long as the distance does. Can't be closed, except by waiting for light to make the crossing. And light takes long enough that its information is outdated by arrival. So you travel, carrying assumptions. Memories of how things were, expectations based on conditions that might not exist anymore. The ship ages slowly relative to the origin. The origin ages faster. Whatever is happening there, whatever has happened in the duration since departure exists, in a different time frame than the ship's experience. The gap between those time frames widens with each day. And in that gap, uncertainty accumulates about what's real versus what you remember, about whether the reasons for leaving still make sense, given how much has changed at both ends. How much might have changed, anyway. No way to verify. Not that verification would alter the trajectory at this point. The ship is committed, moving at velocities that make reversing course impractical, even if new information suggested it would be wise. The uncertainty just sits there, present, but unresolvable. A question that can't be answered because the answer is too distant, too delayed, too separated by the structure of how information propagates through space. You keep moving, keep aging at your own rate, keep existing in your present, while other presents happen elsewhere, inaccessible. The stars ahead don't reveal what's orbiting them. The stars behind don't send updates. Everything is separated by enough distance that what's happening now depends on where you are. When you ask, there's no universal now that includes both ship and origin. Just separate nows, separated by distance, too large for simultaneity to survive. From here aboard the ship now is just this. This moment, this location, this isolation from everything else happening in its own, now sealed behind gaps, too large for information to cross quickly enough to feel current. The real limit isn't distance, though distance creates it. Isn't time, though time enforces it. The limit is confirmation, maybe. Being able to know rather than assume. Being able to verify what's real. And that limit becomes absolute when the gaps involved are measured in light travel time. The distance between stars is measured in light years. Always has been. Light takes that long to cross, for years to the nearest star, dozens to stars farther out, hundreds to reach the more distant ones. And a human life lasts 80 years, maybe 90. If things go well, that gap between how long crossing takes and how long a body lasts has always been there, fixed by how fast light moves and how quickly cells age. But the crossing happens anyway. Or could happen, depending on how the motion works. On how time passes for the person moving versus time elsewhere. Days aboard the ship would still be days, still pass at the regular pace from inside. Waking, waiting, existing through however many rotations happen. While outside, more days, more time accumulating at the origin, at the destination. Everywhere the ship isn't. So the journey that takes centuries from outside takes decades from inside. The traveler ages less, experiences less duration, crosses the distance while younger than the crossing should allow, or would normally allow, or however that works. The distance doesn't change. Light years stay light years. Space doesn't compress because something moves through it quickly, but the experience of crossing does. The waiting does. Duration between departure and arrival becomes something different for the traveler than for everything else. And that difference, it's just there. Can't be undone, can't sink back to match. The ship covers distance whether anyone aboard pays attention or not. Motion is continuous across whatever time it takes, or however much time it feels like it takes. Stars pass, or the ship passes stars. Same thing when motion is mutual, when there's no fixed reference point. Distance between departure and destination shrinks. Distance between ship and origin grows. Both happening, both measured in light years that take, well, years. That's what light years means. Probably the time light takes the traveler ages. Cells dividing, hair growing, time passing in the body's own way. Decades, maybe. Enough to mark the passage from young to middle-aged, while elsewhere, more decades. More aging in places the traveler isn't there to see. The gap between those durations just is. Present as a fact. Built into how motion and time relate. When speed gets high enough, you can cross enormous distances. Reach places light years away while aging only decades. Arrive at distant stars while still alive, still functional. But the place you left ages more. People their age more. The gap widens with travel, no closing it. No making the clocks match again after they've separated. The distance is crossable. The separation remains. Stars continue burning through their fuel. Planets orbit, probably. The universe expands, space stretching, distances growing between objects, not held together by gravity. And somewhere in all that, the ship, too, moving through void, crossing light years, aging slowly. Relative to space around it, time passes. Distance gets covered. The journey goes on. Whether it feels like a journey or just existing in a place that happens to be moving. Eventually, arrival. Eventually, destination close enough to observe. The crossing complete, in whatever sense complete means, when elapsed time depends on where you measure from. But that's later, not now. Now is just the motion. Ongoing covering of distance, passage of time, at its own rate. Different from rates elsewhere, but normal because it's the only rate experienced. The ship is there. The void is there. Distance between them and everything else. All of it, ongoing. Moving forward through time, through space, through whatever duration is left before something changes. Or maybe nothing changes. Maybe the motion just goes on. Distance accumulating. Time passing at separate rates in separate locations. Either way, crossing happens, is happening, will happen, depending on when you ask. The distance is real. The time is real. The motion is real. Somewhere, someone crossing, aging slowly, experiencing decades, while centuries pass elsewhere, reaching distances that seem impossible, but are just distant. Very distant, but crossable, given enough speed. Given time passing differently. Going somewhere still takes time. Farther away means more time. That part hasn't changed. Whose time gets counted? That's different now, or not different. Just noticed, maybe.